The gavel crashes down with finality in Judge Vernon Blackwood's courtroom, the sound echoing off the mahogany-paneled walls like a gunshot. "Death by lethal injection," he declares, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority as he stares down at 17-year-old Elijah Carter, whose hands tremble in shackles. The prosecutor smirks from his table while the defense attorney slumps in defeat, knowing the predetermined outcome was never really in question. Judge Blackwood leans back in his high-backed chair, savoring the moment of power when the massive oak doors at the rear of the courtroom suddenly burst open. Every head turns as a tall, distinguished figure in an impeccable black robe strides purposefully down the center aisle, flanked by federal marshals. The confident chatter from the prosecution table dies instantly. The stranger approaches the bench with unwavering authority and places a protective hand on Elijah's shoulder. His voice cuts through the stunned silence like steel. "Your Honor, that sentence will not stand. This is my son. Before I reveal how this impossible moment came to be, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more stories about justice prevailing over corruption. Because what you're about to discover will shock you to your core. The man standing beside Elijah Carter isn't just any concerned father. He's Chief Justice Benjamin Carter of the United States Supreme Court, the highest judicial authority in the nation. And Judge Blackwood, who just sentenced his son to death in a rigged trial, has no idea his entire world is about to crumble. Now, let me take you back to see how this earth-shattering courtroom confrontation came to be, and how a father's love became the catalyst for exposing the most corrupt judicial conspiracy in modern American history. 6 months earlier, Elijah Carter walked through the halls of Westfield Academy, his backpack heavy with advanced placement textbooks and college application materials. At 17, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned early that excellence was not optional in his family, but a pathway to changing the world. The morning sun streamed through the prestigious private school's tall windows as Elijah made his way to his AP government class, where he served as student body president. His classmates knew him as the guy who organized food drives for local shelters, tutored struggling students for free, and somehow managed to maintain a 4.2 GPA while volunteering at the East Side Community Center every weekend. Elijah, "Wait up," called his best friend Alex Rivera, jogging to catch up in the hallway. "You ready for the college interview this afternoon?" Elijah nodded, adjusting the tie he wore every day to school, a habit his mother had instilled in him since middle school. "Stanford doesn't know what's coming," he replied with a grin. What his classmates didn't know was the weight Elijah carried as the son of Chief Justice Benjamin Carter, the first black Chief Justice in Supreme Court history. At home, dinner conversations revolved around constitutional law, civil rights cases, and the responsibility that came with their family name. His father had taught him early that their privilege came with an obligation to serve others who lacked the same advantages. Elijah had chosen to attend Westfield Academy under his mother's maiden name, Carter, rather than using his father's public surname of Williams Carter. This decision allowed him to build his own identity without the constant shadow of his father's towering reputation. Only the school's headmaster knew his true parentage. Information kept strictly confidential per the family's security requirements. In his government class that morning, Elijah participated in a heated debate about judicial reform and mandatory sentencing guidelines. His professor, Ms. Patterson, had always been impressed by his sophisticated understanding of constitutional law, though she attributed it to exceptional preparation rather than dinner-table discussions with the Chief Justice himself. "The death penalty remains one of our most contentious issues," Ms. Patterson explained to the class. "Studies show significant racial disparities in sentencing, particularly in states like Alabama, Texas, and Georgia." Elijah shifted uncomfortably in his seat, knowing from family discussions that his father grappled with these very statistics in chambers every day. After class, Elijah walked to his part-time job at the East Side Community Center, where he ran an after-school program for middle school students from lower-income neighborhoods. These kids reminded him daily why his family's work mattered. Many came from single-parent homes, some had family members caught up in the justice system, and all deserved the same opportunities Elijah had been born into. "Mr. Elijah," called out 12-year-old Terrell, running up with a math worksheet. "I got all the problems right this time." Elijah high-fived the boy, remembering when Terrell had first arrived at the center, barely able to read at grade level. 6 months of patient tutoring had transformed not just his academic performance, but his confidence. That evening, Elijah sat at the mahogany dining table in his family's Georgetown home, discussing his Stanford interview with his parents. His mother, Dr. Rachel Carter, a prominent civil rights attorney, listened proudly as he described his plans to study constitutional law and eventually follow in both parents' footsteps. "Remember, son," his father said, setting down his coffee cup, "your achievements have to be twice as good to be considered half as equal. That's the reality we're still fighting to change." Chief Justice Carter's words carried the weight of personal experience, his own journey from a poor neighborhood in Birmingham to the highest court in the land had been marked by countless instances where excellence was barely enough to overcome prejudice. Elijah nodded, understanding the dual burden he carried. He was expected to excel, not just for himself, but as a representative of what was possible when barriers were removed. His parents had shielded him from the worst of the racial hostility his father faced in his professional role, but they had never hidden the reality that his success would be scrutinized differently than his white classmates. Later that night, as Elijah worked on his college essays in his bedroom, he reflected on the question every applicant dreaded. Describe a challenge you've overcome. How could he explain the challenge of growing up as the son of one of the most powerful black men in America without revealing his father's identity? How could he articulate the pressure of knowing that his mistakes might somehow reflect on his father's judicial credibility? Instead, he wrote about his work at the community center, about seeing potential in kids that society had already written off, and about his commitment to ensuring that justice truly was blind to race, class, and background. He wrote about dreams of becoming a prosecutor who would reform the system from within, someone who would ensure that cases were decided on evidence and law rather than prejudice and politics. His phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Dude, did you see the news about that case in Mississippi? Another black teenager sentenced to death. Makes you grateful we live where we do." Elijah stared at the message for a long moment, thinking about the randomness of birth and geography. In another life, with different parents and different circumstances, that could have been him facing an unjust system without the protection of privilege and power. As he prepared for bed, Elijah had no way of knowing that in just 3 weeks, his carefully constructed normal world would shatter completely. He couldn't predict that his father's enemies had been watching and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike at the Chief Justice through his greatest vulnerability, his love for his family. That night, Elijah Carter fell asleep in his comfortable bedroom, surrounded by college brochures and scholarship applications, dreaming of a future where he would help perfect the American justice system. He had no idea that very soon he would become a victim of that system's darkest impulses, and that his father would face an impossible choice between his judicial oath and his paternal love. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 weeks later, Elijah Carter found himself in Millbrook County, Alabama, a place that felt like stepping back in time. He had driven down with his debate team for the Southern Regional Championships, proud to represent Westfield Academy at the prestigious tournament. The small town of Millbrook sat in the heart of rural Alabama, where Confederate flags still adorned pickup trucks, and the courthouse square featured a monument to Lost cause heroes. The debate tournament was being held at Millbrook High School, and Elijah's team had performed exceptionally well throughout the day. As the tournament coordinator, 17-year-old Emma Sinclair from the local high school guided visiting teams around town, Elijah found himself drawn into conversation with her about constitutional law and civil rights. Emma was intelligent, articulate, and refreshingly open-minded for someone from such a conservative area. "You really know your stuff about the 14th Amendment," Emma said, as they walked through the town square after the final round. "I've never heard someone our age talk about equal protection with such passion." Elijah smiled, careful not to reveal the source of his knowledge. "I just think the Constitution should mean the same thing for everyone, regardless of where they come from." As evening approached, Elijah realized he had lost track of time. His teammates had already returned to their hotel, and the debate coaches were at a dinner meeting across town. Emma offered to walk with him back to the school parking lot where he had left his car, a silver Honda Accord his parents had given him for his 17th birthday. They were deep in discussion about landmark Supreme Court cases when a police cruiser pulled up alongside them. Sheriff Dale Watkins, a thick-set man in his 50s with cold grey eyes, stepped out of the vehicle. Behind him emerged Deputy Roy Clemens, younger but carrying the same air of menacing authority that seemed bred into local law enforcement. "Evening, Emma," Sheriff Watkins said, his voice deceptively friendly. "You know better than to be wandering around town after dark with strangers." His eyes fixed on Elijah with unmistakable hostility. "Boy, you're not from around here." Elijah felt his stomach tighten, but he maintained his composure. "Good evening, officers. I'm Elijah Carter, visiting for the debate tournament. I was just heading back to my car." He gestured toward the school parking lot 2 blocks away. "Debate tournament," Deputy Clemens snorted. "What kind of debate? How to steal cars without getting caught?" Both officers chuckled at the crude joke, while Emma shifted uncomfortably beside Elijah. "Sheriff Watkins, he's one of the visiting debaters," Emma interjected. "They're staying at the Hampton Inn. The tournament ended hours ago." Her voice carried a note of warning, suggesting she knew how quickly situations could escalate in Millbrook. Sheriff Watkins ignored her completely, his attention focused entirely on Elijah. "Let me see some identification, boy. And keep your hands where I can see them." The command was delivered with the casual authority of someone accustomed to complete obedience. Elijah slowly reached for his wallet, narrating his movements as his parents had taught him. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my back pocket. My identification is inside." He produced his driver's license and school ID, handing them over with steady hands, despite his racing heartbeat. Sheriff Watkins examined the documents with theatrical skepticism. "Says here you're from Washington, D.C. That's a long way from Alabama. What's a city boy like you really doing in Millbrook?" The implication in his tone was clear. Elijah didn't belong here and wasn't welcome. "I told you, sir. I'm here for the debate tournament with my school team. We're staying at the Hampton Inn tonight and driving back to D.C. tomorrow morning." Elijah's voice remained respectful, though he could feel anger building beneath his carefully maintained exterior. Deputy Clemens had been circling around to Elijah's other side, a classic intimidation tactic. "Awful fancy car for a high school student," he observed, peering into the Honda's windows. "You sure this belongs to you? Maybe we should run the plates, see if it comes back stolen." Emma stepped forward, her voice sharp with indignation. "Sheriff, this is ridiculous. I've been with him for 2 hours. He's exactly who he says he is. The tournament coordinators can verify everything." Her intervention only seemed to irritate the officers further. "Miss Sinclair, I think you'd better head on home now," Sheriff Watkins said, his tone brooking no argument. "Your father wouldn't want you mixed up in this situation." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. "Cooperate, or face consequences." Emma looked torn between staying to support Elijah and avoiding trouble for herself. "Elijah, do you have the tournament coordinator's number?" "I can call Mrs. Henderson to verify." "That won't be necessary," Sheriff Watkins cut her off. We'll handle this our way. He turned back to Elijah, his expression hardening. Son, I've been policing this county for 23 years, and I can smell trouble from a mile away. You've got that look about you. What look is that, sir? Elijah asked, though he already knew the answer. The look of someone who thinks they're better than the folks around here. Someone who thinks they can come into our town and do whatever they please. Sheriff Watkins stepped closer, invading Elijah's personal space. Maybe we need to teach you some respect. Deputy Clemens had completed his circle and now stood behind Elijah, blocking any retreat. Sheriff, I'm seeing some suspicious movements here. Looks like he might be reaching for something. The lie was delivered with practiced ease, setting up justification for whatever came next. Elijah raised his hands immediately, palms visible. I'm not reaching for anything, officers. My hands are in plain sight. But he could sense the situation spiraling beyond his control, despite his careful compliance with every command. That's not what I saw, Deputy Clemens insisted. Looked to me like he was going for a weapon. In a place like this, with recent break-ins reported, we can't take any chances. The fabricated narrative was taking shape, each lie building on the previous one. Emma watched in horror as the officers closed in on Elijah. This is insane. He hasn't done anything wrong. I'm calling my father. She reached for her phone, but Sheriff Watkins quickly intervened. Put that phone away, young lady, or you'll be charged with interfering with a police investigation. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, and Emma reluctantly complied, tears of frustration beginning to form in her eyes. Within moments, Elijah found himself pressed against the side of the police cruiser. His arms twisted behind his back as cold metal handcuffs bit into his wrists. You're under arrest for suspicious behavior, resisting arrest, and potential vehicle theft, Sheriff Watkins announced, though Elijah had done nothing but answer questions and comply with every command. This is wrong, Emma called out desperately. He's done nothing illegal. This is completely unjustified. But her protests fell on deaf ears as the officers loaded Elijah into the back of their cruiser. As the police car pulled away from the town square, Elijah caught a glimpse of Emma standing alone under the streetlight, her phone pressed to her ear, presumably calling for help that he feared would arrive too late. He had no way of knowing that this seemingly random encounter had been carefully orchestrated, or that powerful forces had been waiting for exactly this opportunity to strike at his father through him. The car headed toward the Millbrook County Jail, carrying a young man who had committed no crime other than existing in the wrong place with the wrong skin color, in a system designed to ensure that justice remained anything but blind. The Millbrook County Jail reeked of disinfectant, stale cigarettes, and human desperation. As Elijah Carter was processed through the intake system, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an ominous frequency that seemed to match his racing heartbeat. The booking officer, Sergeant Mills, looked up from his paperwork with the weary expression of someone who had seen this routine countless times before. "Name?" Sergeant Mills barked, without looking at Elijah directly. His fingers hovered over an ancient computer keyboard, ready to input another entry into the system that would reduce a human being to a case number and a set of charges. "Elijah Carter," he replied, his voice steady, despite the surreal nature of finding himself in handcuffs for the first time in his life. The sergeant typed slowly, hunting and pecking at keys, while Elijah stood there in leg shackles that had been added during transport, their weight a constant reminder of his complete powerlessness in this moment. "Age," Mills continued his bureaucratic recitation. 17. For the first time, Sergeant Mills looked up, his eyebrows raised slightly. 17. Well, aren't you a young one to be causing trouble? He made a note on his paperwork. Looks like we'll be trying you as an adult. Sheriff Watkins has specific instructions about your case. Elijah felt his stomach drop. Being tried as an adult meant facing the full weight of the criminal justice system, without the protections typically afforded to juveniles. "I'd like to call my parents," he said, remembering his constitutional rights, even as the system seemed designed to make him forget them. Sergeant Mills chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Phone calls are a privilege, not a right, son. You'll get your call when we're good and ready to let you have it. Right now we've got more pressing matters to attend to." The intake process continued with methodical dehumanization. Elijah's personal belongings were confiscated and catalogued. His wallet containing $127 in cash, his cell phone, his watch, his father's class ring that he'd been given for his 17th birthday, and even his shoelaces. Each item was placed in a plastic bag and sealed, physical evidence of the life that existed before this nightmare began. "Strip search," Mills announced, leading Elijah to a small, windowless room where 2 guards waited. The humiliation was deliberate and thorough, designed to break down any remaining sense of dignity or self-worth. Throughout the degrading process, Elijah forced himself to remember his father's words about maintaining inner strength, even when external circumstances sought to destroy it. Following the search, Elijah was issued an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame, the bright color marking him as property of the Millbrook County Correctional System. The guards led him through a series of locked doors, each clang of metal against metal echoing through corridors, painted an institutional green that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who walked these halls. His first stop was a holding cell where 3 other men waited for their own processing to continue. The oldest, a weathered black man in his 50s named Roosevelt Washington, looked up as Elijah entered. "First time?" he asked, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had navigated this system more times than he cared to remember. Elijah nodded, taking a seat on the cold metal bench that served as the cell's only furniture. "What are you in for?" Roosevelt asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "They said suspicious behavior and resisting arrest," Elijah replied, the absurdity of the charges evident even to himself. "I was walking with a local girl after a debate tournament. Sheriff said I looked like trouble." Roosevelt shook his head with bitter familiarity. "Debate tournament. They don't like educated ones around here. Makes them nervous when they can't dismiss you as easily." He gestured around the cell. "This whole place runs on keeping certain folks in their place. You just happened to step outside the lines they drew." The other occupants of the cell, both white men arrested on drug-related charges, remained silent, but listened intently to the conversation. One of them, a young man named Tommy, who couldn't have been much older than Elijah, finally spoke up. "My cousin works at the courthouse. Says Judge Blackwood's been in a mood lately. Something about making examples of troublemakers." The mention of Judge Vernon Blackwood's name sent a chill through the cell. Roosevelt's expression darkened considerably. "Blackwood's been the hanging judge in this county for 15 years. Never met a black defendant he didn't want to throw the book at. If you're going before him, son, you better pray for a miracle." Hours passed without any word about phone calls or legal representation. Elijah's requests to contact his family were met with dismissive responses from guards who seemed to take pleasure in his growing desperation. "Your folks probably don't even know you're missing yet," one guard taunted. "Might be days before anyone comes looking for you." As afternoon turned to evening, Elijah was finally moved to a more permanent cell block, where he encountered Marcus Webb, a court-appointed defense attorney who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Webb was thin, nervous, and carried himself with the defeated air of someone who had long ago stopped believing in the possibility of justice for his clients. "Elijah Carter?" Webb asked, consulting a file that appeared remarkably thin for someone facing serious charges. "I'm your lawyer. We need to talk about your case." They met in a small interview room where the walls seemed to close in around them. Webb spread out his meager paperwork and cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I'll be direct with you, son. The charges against you are serious, and this jurisdiction doesn't take kindly to outsiders causing trouble." "But I didn't cause any trouble," Elijah protested. "I was just walking with a local student. I never resisted arrest or did anything suspicious. Webb held up a hand to stop him. What you did or didn't do doesn't matter as much as what the sheriff's report says you did. And according to that report, you were acting suspiciously, refused to comply with lawful orders, and made threatening gestures toward the officers. Elijah stared at the attorney in disbelief. None of that is true. There was a witness, Emma Sinclair. She saw everything. She can testify that I cooperated completely. Miss Sinclair, Webb said, consulting his notes. Yes, well, her father is the bank president in town. He's already made it clear that his daughter won't be available to testify on behalf of someone who was clearly up to no good. The lawyer's tone suggested he found nothing unusual about a witness being intimidated into silence. This is insane, Elijah said, his careful composure finally beginning to crack. You're my lawyer. Aren't you supposed to fight for me? Webb looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time. Son, I've been practicing law in this county for 12 years. I know how things work here. The best I can do for you is negotiate a plea deal that might keep you from facing the worst possible outcome. What's the worst possible outcome? Elijah asked, though he dreaded the answer. Webb consulted his paperwork again, as if the answer might have changed since he last looked. Judge Blackwood is planning to charge you as an adult with aggravated assault on a police officer, attempted vehicle theft, and resisting arrest with violence. In Alabama, with the right circumstances and the wrong judge, that combination could potentially carry a death sentence. The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. Death sentence. For walking down a street and being polite to local law enforcement. The absurdity was so complete that for a moment he wondered if this was all some elaborate nightmare from which he would soon wake up. I need to call my father, Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. Please, just let me make one phone call. Webb gathered his papers, clearly eager to end this uncomfortable conversation. I'll see what I can do, but don't get your hopes up. The sheriff likes to keep outside influences to a minimum during the initial stages of these cases. He paused at the door. Son, if you've got any family with political connections or legal influence, now would be the time to figure out how to reach them. As Webb left the interview room, Elijah remained seated at the metal table, staring at the scratched surface where countless other defendants had perhaps received similar news about their fates. He thought about his father, hundreds of miles away in Washington, probably wondering why Elijah hadn't called to report on the debate tournament's results. He thought about his mother, who might not even know yet that her son was sitting in a jail cell facing charges that could end his life. Most of all, he thought about the cruel irony that the son of the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court was about to become a victim of the very system his father had dedicated his life to perfecting. The system that was supposed to protect the innocent had instead marked him for destruction, and somewhere in this county, powerful people were undoubtedly congratulating themselves on a job well done. 200 miles away in Washington, D.C., Chief Justice Benjamin Carter sat in his mahogany-paneled chambers, reviewing briefs for the next day's oral arguments. The Supreme Court building hummed with its usual late-afternoon activity as clerks researched precedents and justices prepared for cases that would shape American law for generations. At 62, Chief Justice Carter commanded respect not just for his position, but for his methodical brilliance and unwavering commitment to constitutional principles. His corner office reflected both his scholarly nature and his understanding of history's weight. Portraits of previous Chief Justices lined one wall, while floor-to-ceiling bookshelves contained volumes of legal precedent dating back to the founding of the Republic. On his desk sat 3 photographs: his law school graduation, his swearing-in ceremony as Chief Justice, and a family portrait taken last Christmas with his wife Rachel and son Elijah, Justice Carter's secretary. Mrs. Helen Morrison knocked softly before entering. Chief Justice, your wife called. She's concerned because Elijah hasn't checked in from his debate tournament. She expected to hear from him hours ago. Mrs. Morrison had worked for 3 Chief Justices, over her 30-year career and had developed an instinct for distinguishing routine concerns from genuine emergencies. Chief Justice Carter glanced at his watch. It was nearly 8 o'clock, and Elijah was usually meticulous about maintaining contact during school trips. Did Rachel try calling his cell phone directly? He asked, setting aside the brief he'd been reviewing. Multiple times, sir. It goes straight to voicemail. She also called the hotel where the debate team was supposed to be staying. They have no record of the group checking in. Mrs. Morrison's voice carried a note of concern that reflected her own maternal feelings toward the Chief Justice's family. Cold knot began forming in Chief Justice Carter's stomach. Elijah had been excited about this tournament for weeks, particularly because it represented his first major competition as team captain. For him to simply disappear without communication was completely out of character. "Get me the tournament director's contact information," he instructed, "and see if you can reach the Westfield Academy debate coach." Mrs. Morrison nodded efficiently. "I've already taken the liberty of making those calls, sir." The tournament director, Mrs. Patricia Henderson, confirms that Elijah participated in all scheduled rounds and performed exceptionally well. However, she lost track of him after the final session ended around 4 o'clock. The debate coach, Mr. Franklin, assumed Elijah was with his teammates, but when they gathered at the hotel, he wasn't there. Chief Justice Carter felt his judicial composure beginning to crack. In his professional role, he dealt with life and death issues every day, but those cases involved other people's families. This was his son, his brilliant, principled, careful son who understood better than most teenagers the importance of staying safe and maintaining communication. "Sir," Mrs. Morrison continued hesitantly. Mrs. Henderson mentioned something else. She said a local student named Emma Sinclair called her around 9 o'clock last night, very upset about something that happened involving one of the visiting debaters. When Mrs. Henderson tried to call back this morning, Emma's father answered and said his daughter wouldn't be speaking to anyone about tournament-related matters. The Chief Justice stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward as legal training and paternal instinct began working in concert. "Get me everything you can find about Millbrook County, Alabama. Police records, court schedules, recent arrests. And get Deputy Attorney General Richardson on the phone immediately." As Mrs. Morrison hurried to execute his instructions, Chief Justice Carter paced his office, his mind racing through possibilities. His son could have been in an accident, but hospitals would have contacted the family by now. He could have had car trouble, but that wouldn't explain his phone going straight to voicemail. The mention of Emma Sinclair's distressed call, followed by her father's refusal to let her speak further, suggested something more sinister. 20 minutes later, Deputy Attorney General Lisa Richardson called back with preliminary information that confirmed Chief Justice Carter's worst fears. "Benjamin, I've got some troubling news. Elijah was arrested last night in Millbrook County on charges of suspicious behavior and resisting arrest. He's being held in the county jail, and according to our sources, they're planning to charge him as an adult." Chief Justice Carter felt the world shift beneath his feet. His son, the honor student who tutored underprivileged children and dreamed of reforming the justice system, was sitting in a jail cell facing adult criminal charges. "What evidence do they have?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "From what we can gather, it appears he was walking with a local girl after the debate tournament when Sheriff Dale Watkins decided he looked suspicious. The arrest report claims he resisted commands and made threatening gestures. But we both know how reliable those reports tend to be in certain jurisdictions." Chief Justice Carter's hands clenched into fists as he absorbed this information. He had spent decades fighting against exactly this kind of discriminatory policing, working within the system to ensure equal protection under law. Now his own son had become a victim of the very injustices he'd dedicated his career to eliminating. "There's more, Benjamin," Richardson continued, her voice heavy with implication. "This isn't random. Millbrook County is in Judge Vernon Blackwood's jurisdiction. You remember Blackwood, He's the one whose death penalty sentences you overturned 3 times in the past 2 years. Each time, he publicly criticized the Supreme Court's interference in state criminal justice matters. The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. Judge Blackwood had been humiliated repeatedly by Chief Justice Carter's majority opinions that found constitutional violations in his handling of capital cases. The judge had made public statements about activist judges undermining law and order, barely disguised attacks on the Chief Justice personally. Now somehow Blackwood had Elijah in his power. "They're going to try to use my son as leverage," Chief Justice Carter said, the words bitter in his mouth. "They think they can force me to recuse myself from cases involving state criminal justice, or perhaps influence my future opinions." "It's possible," Richardson agreed. "But there's an even worse scenario. What if they simply want revenge? What if they plan to railroad your son through their corrupt system as payback for your rulings?" Judge Blackwood has never been subtle about his feelings regarding federal oversight of state courts. Chief Justice Carter moved to the window overlooking the Supreme Court's marble plaza, where tourists photographed the building that represented the highest ideals of American justice. Those same ideals were now being perverted in an Alabama courthouse where his son sat terrified and alone, facing trumped-up charges that could destroy his future. "What are our options?" he asked, though his legal mind was already analyzing the constraints of his position. As Chief Justice, he couldn't simply use federal resources to intervene in a state criminal matter without proper justification. Any appearance of impropriety could undermine not just his own credibility, but the integrity of the entire Supreme Court. "I've already dispatched FBI agents to Millbrook County to investigate potential civil rights violations," Richardson replied. "We're also reaching out to the Alabama Attorney General's office to express federal interest in ensuring proper procedures are followed. However, we have to be careful not to appear as though we're using federal power to benefit your family personally." Chief Justice Carter understood the delicate balance required. His enemies were counting on his ethical constraints to prevent him from acting decisively. They assumed he would be paralyzed by the need to maintain judicial propriety, while his son faced a rigged system designed to destroy him. "Lisa," he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had shaped constitutional law for nearly a decade, "I want you to understand something clearly. I will not allow my son to become a casualty in someone else's political war against the federal judiciary. If they think they can use him as a weapon against the Constitution itself, they've gravely miscalculated." Richardson recognized the steel beneath her boss's measured words. "What do you need from me, Benjamin?" Chief Justice Carter turned from the window, his expression transforming from concerned father to the most powerful judicial figure in America. "Prepare a comprehensive civil rights investigation into Millbrook County's criminal justice practices. I want every case, every sentence, every complaint from the past 5 years reviewed. And get me a secure line to the Alabama governor's office." As he began mobilizing resources, Chief Justice Carter reflected on the bitter irony of his situation. He had spent his career believing that the system, however flawed, could be reformed from within through patient work and principled decisions. Now faced with a direct attack on his family, he was about to discover just how far that system's defenders were willing to go to preserve their power. His son's freedom, and possibly his life, hung in the balance. The Chief Justice of the United States was about to go to war. Within 6 hours of learning about Elijah's arrest, Chief Justice Carter had transformed his Georgetown home into a command center that would have impressed military strategists. His study, normally a quiet sanctuary filled with legal texts and constitutional histories, now buzzed with secure phone lines, encrypted laptops, and federal agents coordinating a multi-pronged investigation into Millbrook County's criminal justice system. Special Agent Victoria Hayes, a 20-year veteran of the FBI's Civil Rights Division, spread case files across the Chief Justice's mahogany desk. "Sir, what we've uncovered in the past few hours confirms your worst suspicions. Millbrook County operates essentially as a closed system designed to generate revenue through selective prosecution and plea bargaining." Dr. Rachel Carter, still in her courtroom attire from an emergency motion she'd filed that afternoon, reviewed statistical analyses prepared by the Justice Department's data analysis team. As a civil rights attorney, she had seen discriminatory patterns before, but the scope of Millbrook County's systematic bias was staggering even by her experienced standards. "The numbers tell the story," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "In the past 5 years, black defendants in Millbrook County have been 400% more likely to receive maximum sentences compared to white defendants charged with identical crimes. They're also 600% more likely to be denied bail, even for minor offenses." Agent Hayes nodded grimly. "But it gets worse. We've identified a pattern of targeting educated black visitors to the county. In the past 3 years, at least 12 college students or young professionals passing through the area have been arrested on similar pretexts. Most accepted plea deals rather than fight charges in an obviously hostile environment." Chief Justice Carter studied photographs of previous victims, each one a bright young person whose life had been derailed by encountering Millbrook County's version of justice. "What happened to those who refused to plead guilty?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "2 received disproportionately harsh sentences that effectively destroyed their educational and career prospects," Agent Hayes replied. "One young man, Marcus Williams, was sentenced to 15 years for allegedly resisting arrest during a traffic stop. He's currently serving his sentence in Alabama State Prison. His full scholarship to medical school, nothing but a memory." The pattern was clear and horrifying. Millbrook County had perfected a system of legal lynching that destroyed promising young black lives while maintaining the veneer of due process. Judge Vernon Blackwood sat at the center of this web, protected by prosecutorial immunity and judicial independence that made direct federal intervention extremely challenging. "We've also uncovered communications between Judge Blackwood and certain political figures that suggest this attack on Elijah was specifically planned," Agent Hayes continued, producing a series of encrypted emails that had been recovered through federal intelligence assets. 3 weeks ago, someone alerted Blackwood's office that the Chief Justice's son would be traveling through Alabama as part of a debate tournament. Chief Justice Carter's hands clenched as he read the communications. The messages, while carefully worded to avoid explicit criminal conspiracy, made clear that Blackwood and his associates saw Elijah's arrest as an opportunity to send a message to the federal judiciary about interfering in state criminal justice matters. Dr. Carter looked up from her statistical review, her expression reflecting both professional outrage and maternal fury. "They're using our son as a weapon against constitutional law itself. This isn't just about revenge against Benjamin's rulings. It's about intimidating the entire federal judiciary." Special Agent Hayes received a text message and immediately picked up her secure phone. After a brief conversation, she turned back to the Chief Justice with an expression of urgent concern. "Sir, we have a problem. Judge Blackwood has scheduled an emergency arraignment for tomorrow morning. He's planning to formally charge Elijah with capital murder." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Capital murder charges would mean Elijah could face the death penalty, transforming what had been an outrageous but manageable situation into a life-or-death crisis. Even more troubling, emergency arraignments were typically reserved for the most serious cases where flight risk or public safety concerns demanded immediate action. "Capital murder?" Dr. Carter asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are they claiming he murdered?" Agent Hayes consulted her notes with visible reluctance. "According to sources in the county clerk's office, they're alleging that during his arrest, Elijah made threatening movements that put Officer Clemens in fear for his life, constituting attempted murder of a law enforcement officer. Under Alabama's capital murder statute, attempted murder of a police officer during the commission of another felony can be charged as capital murder. Chief Justice Carter felt rage building within him like nothing he had experienced in his decades of legal practice. They were going to try to execute his son based on fabricated charges that no reasonable person would believe. The system he had devoted his life to serving was being perverted into an instrument of political revenge. "We need more than statistical evidence," he said, his voice deadly calm. "We need witnesses, recordings, anything that can demonstrate the conspiracy behind these charges." He turned to Agent Hayes. "What about the local girl who was with Elijah when he was arrested?" "Emma Sinclair," Agent Hayes replied, consulting her files. "We've attempted to contact her multiple times, but her father has hired local attorneys to prevent any federal agents from speaking with her. He's claiming she's traumatized by the incident and unavailable for interviews." Dr. Carter stood and began pacing the study, her legal mind working through possibilities. "They're isolating all potential witnesses and controlling the narrative. It's a textbook approach to railroading a defendant, but they're doing it with remarkable sophistication." "There may be another way," Agent Hayes said thoughtfully. "We've identified a courthouse clerk named Patricia Monroe, who's been documenting irregularities in Judge Blackwood's court for months. She reached out to the FBI tip line this afternoon, claiming she has evidence of systematic corruption but was afraid to come forward until now." Chief Justice Carter seized on this potential breakthrough. "What kind of evidence?" "Audio recordings," Agent Hayes replied. "Apparently, Ms. Monroe has been secretly recording conversations in the courthouse because she suspected something was wrong. She claims to have recordings of Judge Blackwood and Sheriff Watkins discussing plans to teach the federal judiciary a lesson through your son's case. The significance of such recordings could not be overstated. Direct evidence of conspiracy would transform this from a difficult civil rights case into a clear federal crime that would justify immediate intervention. However, obtaining and validating such evidence would require careful coordination to ensure its admissibility in court." "Sir," Agent Hayes continued, "there's something else you need to know. We've learned that certain political figures have been pressuring the Alabama governor's office to resist any federal intervention in this case. Senator Crawford specifically called the governor this afternoon, arguing that federal interference would set a dangerous precedent for state sovereignty." Chief Justice Carter recognized the political dimensions of the crisis. His enemies were mobilizing not just locally, but at the state and federal levels, trying to isolate him and prevent any effective response to his son's persecution. They were counting on his ethical constraints and respect for legal procedure to limit his options, while they destroyed Elijah through their corrupt system. "Time is not on our side," Dr. Carter observed. "Once they formally charge him with capital murder, the case will take on a momentum that will be extremely difficult to stop. We need to act decisively within the next 12 hours. Chief Justice Carter moved to his window, looking out at the Washington skyline, where the lights of federal buildings represented the rule of law he had sworn to protect. Tomorrow morning, his son would stand before a corrupt judge in a rigged courtroom, facing charges that could end his life. The irony was almost unbearable. The Chief Justice of the United States, the most powerful judicial figure in America, was watching helplessly as his child became a victim of the very system he led, but perhaps not helplessly. As Agent Hayes prepared to coordinate with Patricia Monroe to secure the courthouse recordings, Chief Justice Carter began formulating a response that would test the limits of federal power and judicial ethics. His son's life hung in the balance, and he was about to discover just how far a father. At 6 a.m. the following morning, Judge Vernon Blackwood arrived at the Millbrook County Courthouse, expecting to preside over what he believed would be his greatest triumph against federal judicial overreach. Instead, he found federal agents securing the building and U.S. marshals stationed at every entrance. The sight that greeted him in the parking lot would have been comical if the stakes hadn't been so deadly serious. Special Agent Hayes approached Judge Blackwood as he exited his vehicle, her badge prominently displayed and her expression professionally neutral. "Your Honor, I'm Agent Hayes with the FBI Civil Rights Division. We have a federal warrant to search these premises as part of an ongoing investigation into systematic civil rights violations." Blackwood's face flushed red with indignation. "This is outrageous. You have no jurisdiction over state criminal proceedings. I'm calling the governor immediately." His voice carried the bluster of someone accustomed to absolute local authority, suddenly finding that authority challenged by a higher power. "You're certainly free to make any calls you wish." "Your Honor," Agent Hayes replied calmly. "However, the search will proceed under federal authority. We also have recordings of conversations conducted in this courthouse that suggest criminal conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law." The mention of recordings sent visible shock through Blackwood's composure. His eyes darted toward the courthouse windows, clearly calculating which conversations might have been overheard and by whom. Patricia Monroe, the courthouse clerk who had been secretly documenting corruption, had provided the FBI with dozens of hours of audio that painted a damning picture of coordinated efforts to target black defendants. Meanwhile, in Washington, Chief Justice Carter received an urgent call from Alabama Governor Patricia Hartwell. The governor's voice carried barely concealed panic as she attempted to manage a situation spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Chief Justice Carter, I need to speak with you about this federal investigation in Millbrook County. Senator Crawford and several state legislators are demanding that I resist federal interference in our judicial system." "Governor Hartwell," Chief Justice Carter replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had shaped constitutional law for nearly a decade. "My son is sitting in a jail cell facing fabricated capital murder charges. If your judicial system was functioning properly, federal intervention wouldn't be necessary." "But sir, this sets a dangerous precedent," Governor Hartwell protested. "If the federal government can simply override state criminal proceedings whenever a federal official's family is involved, it undermines the entire concept of federalism." Chief Justice Carter's response was measured but unmistakable in its implications. "Governor, federalism doesn't include the right to railroad innocent people through corrupt courts. If Alabama cannot ensure constitutional protections for all defendants, then federal oversight becomes not just appropriate, but mandatory." The political pressure was mounting from multiple directions. Senator Crawford had spent the early morning hours calling congressional allies, framing the federal intervention as executive branch overreach that threatened state sovereignty. Several conservative legal organizations issued statements condemning what they termed judicial activism in real time. Back in Millbrook County, Sheriff Dale Watkins found himself in an increasingly untenable position. The federal agents had seized all arrest records related to Elijah's case, and preliminary analysis revealed discrepancies between different versions of the incident report. More damaging still, Agent Hayes had located additional witnesses who contradicted the official narrative. Tom Bradley, a maintenance worker at the high school, had been emptying trash cans near the parking lot when Elijah was arrested. His account, given to federal agents that morning, painted a picture completely at odds with the sheriff's report. "That boy never resisted nothing," Bradley told investigators. "He was polite as could be, hands visible the whole time. Them officers was looking for trouble from the minute they stepped out of their car." The discovery of corroborating witnesses began unraveling the carefully constructed case against Elijah. Emma Sinclair, despite her father's efforts to silence her, had managed to secretly record her own account of events on her phone immediately after the arrest. When federal agents obtained a warrant for her phone records, they found a detailed voice memo describing Elijah's complete cooperation and the officer's obvious bias. Judge Blackwood, realizing his position was becoming increasingly precarious, made a desperate gambit. He called an emergency press conference for noon, hoping to frame the federal intervention as political persecution of state judicial independence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the assembled local media, "we are witnessing an unprecedented assault on the constitutional separation of powers." His performance was carefully calculated to appeal to states' rights sentiment, but it backfired spectacularly when Agent Hayes released portions of the courthouse recordings during her own press conference an hour later. The audio revealed Blackwood discussing plans to make an example of Elijah Carter specifically because of his father's identity. "This isn't about states' rights," Agent Hayes told reporters. "This is about a corrupt local system that deliberately targeted a teenager because of who his father is. That's not judicial independence, that's criminal conspiracy." The recordings were devastating. In one particularly damning conversation, Judge Blackwood could be heard telling Sheriff Watkins, "The Chief Justice thinks he can overturn our sentences and lecture us about constitutional law. Let's see how he feels when his own boy faces Alabama justice." As news of the conspiracy spread beyond local media, national outlets picked up the story. The optics were impossible for Blackwood's defenders to spin positively. A corrupt judge targeting a teenager to get revenge against his father's judicial decisions. Public opinion began shifting rapidly as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. By afternoon, the political calculus had changed dramatically. Governor Hartwell, facing mounting pressure from both federal authorities and her own conscience, announced that the state would cooperate fully with the federal investigation. Senator Crawford's office issued a carefully worded statement expressing confidence in the federal justice system's ability to ensure fair proceedings. Judge Blackwood made one final attempt to salvage his position, releasing a statement claiming that federal agents had violated state sovereignty and that any evidence obtained through illegal federal intrusion should be inadmissible. His argument had merit within certain legal frameworks, but it rang hollow in the face of clear evidence of corruption and conspiracy. The most significant development came when Marcus Webb, Elijah's court-appointed attorney, approached federal investigators with his own evidence of systematic corruption. "I've been documenting Judge Blackwood's bias for months," he admitted to Agent Hayes. "I was afraid to come forward because I have to practice in this county, but this case crossed a line I can't ignore." Webb produced files showing patterns of predetermined outcomes, manipulated jury selection, and coordinated efforts between the judge's office and local prosecutors to ensure convictions regardless of evidence. His testimony provided crucial insider corroboration of the federal government's case. As evening approached, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Judge Blackwood, once confident in his local authority and political protection, found himself isolated and facing potential federal charges. Sheriff Watkins had been suspended pending investigation, and the entire Millbrook County criminal justice system was under federal oversight. Chief Justice Carter, monitoring developments from Washington, felt cautious optimism for the first time since learning of his son's arrest. The conspiracy was unraveling, the evidence was overwhelming, and public opinion had turned decisively against Elijah's persecutors. However, cornered animals are often most dangerous, and Judge Blackwood still controlled the immediate legal proceedings. The emergency arraignment was still scheduled for the following morning, and until federal authorities could formally intervene in the state criminal case, Elijah remained vulnerable to whatever final acts of revenge a desperate judge might attempt. The Millbrook County Courthouse had never seen anything like the scene that unfolded on the morning of Elijah Carter's emergency arraignment. Federal agents flanked every entrance, while national media crews filled the street outside, their satellite trucks creating a technological perimeter around the 19th century building. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with an energy that spoke of historical significance in the making. Judge Vernon Blackwood entered his courtroom that morning, knowing his career was effectively over, but determined to make one final statement about state judicial authority. His black robes seemed to hang more heavily on his shoulders as he surveyed a gallery packed with federal officials, civil rights attorneys, and journalists from across the country. This was no longer a routine local proceeding, but a test of constitutional principles that would reverberate far beyond Millbrook County. Elijah Carter sat at the defense table beside a new attorney, federal public defender Sarah Chen, who had arrived overnight with a team of civil rights lawyers. Gone was the defeated Marcus Webb, replaced by one of the most formidable constitutional attorneys in the country. Elijah looked tired but resolute, drawing strength from the knowledge that his ordeal was finally receiving the attention it deserved. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Blackwood took his seat. The packed courtroom rose as one, but the usual deference was notably absent. Too many people in the room knew exactly what kind of proceeding they were witnessing, and their body language suggested they were there to bear witness rather than participate in legitimate justice. Judge Blackwood's opening statement was carefully crafted to appeal to states' rights sentiment while maintaining judicial dignity. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to address serious criminal charges against the defendant, Elijah Carter. Despite the unprecedented federal interference in this local matter, this court will proceed according to Alabama law and constitutional procedure." Federal Public Defender Chen rose immediately. "Your Honor, before any proceedings continue, the defense moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Carter based on evidence of systematic civil rights violations and prosecutorial misconduct." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had argued before the Supreme Court and won. "Motion denied," Judge Blackwood replied quickly, almost as if he had anticipated this exact challenge. "This court will not be intimidated by federal pressure or media attention. The charges against Mr. Carter are serious and based on sworn testimony from law enforcement officers." Chen remained standing, her posture suggesting she was far from finished. "Your Honor, the defense has audio recordings of conversations between this court and law enforcement officials that demonstrate clear bias and predetermined outcomes. We request immediate access to review these materials before any plea is entered." The mention of audio recordings sent a visible ripple through the courtroom. Judge Blackwood's composure cracked slightly as he realized the full extent of evidence arrayed against him. Such alleged recordings, if they exist, would have been obtained illegally and are inadmissible in this court. Special Agent Hayes, seated in the front row of the gallery, stood and addressed the court directly. "Your Honor, I'm Special Agent Victoria Hayes, FBI Civil Rights Division. The recordings were obtained through legitimate federal investigation with proper warrants. We have documentation of criminal conspiracy to violate Mr. Carter's constitutional rights." Judge Blackwood's face flushed red with indignation. "Agent Hayes, you are out of order. Federal agents have no standing in state criminal proceedings." His voice carried desperation disguised as authority, the sound of someone watching their power slip away in real time. "Actually, Your Honor," came a new voice from the back of the courtroom, "federal agents have every right to ensure constitutional protections are observed in state proceedings." Every head in the courtroom turned as Chief Justice Benjamin Carter walked down the center aisle. Flanked by U.S. Marshals, his presence transformed the atmosphere completely, bringing with it the full weight of federal judicial authority. Spectators gasped as they realized they were witnessing the highest-ranking judge in America entering a local courthouse to protect his son. Judge Blackwood's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he processed the implications of Chief Justice Carter's presence. The man whose judicial decisions he had spent years railing against now stood in his courtroom, representing not just federal authority but paternal determination. "Your Honor," Chief Justice Carter said, his voice carrying the measured authority that had shaped constitutional law for nearly a decade, "I am here as a father concerned about his son's constitutional rights, And as Chief Justice of the United States concerned about systematic violations of federal law in this jurisdiction. The courtroom fell completely silent as Judge Blackwood struggled to maintain his composure. Facing the Chief Justice in person, surrounded by federal agents and national media, the local judge's authority seemed suddenly insignificant. "Chief Justice Carter," he managed finally, "while I respect your position, this court has jurisdiction over state criminal matters. Not when those criminal matters involve federal civil rights violations," Chief Justice Carter replied calmly. "Agent Hayes, please present the evidence." Agent Hayes approached the bench with a thick folder containing transcripts, audio files, and documentary evidence of the conspiracy against Elijah. As she began reading from the transcripts, Judge Blackwood's own words filled the courtroom, revealing his bias and predetermined intent to punish Elijah because of his father's identity. "The Chief Justice thinks he can overturn our sentences and lecture us about constitutional law," Agent Hayes read from the transcript. "Let's see how he feels when his own boy faces Alabama justice. Your Honor, these are your words, recorded in this courthouse 3 days ago." The impact was devastating. Reporters frantically took notes, while federal officials documented what would become one of the most significant civil rights cases of the decade. Judge Blackwood's carefully constructed facade of legitimate judicial authority crumbled under the weight of his own recorded words. Federal Public Defender Chen seized the moment. "Your Honor, in light of this evidence of judicial bias and civil rights conspiracy, the defense demands immediate dismissal of all charges and transfer of this case to federal jurisdiction." Judge Blackwood made one final attempt to maintain control. "I will not be dictated to by federal authorities in my own courtroom. The charges against this defendant are legitimate, regardless of any alleged conversations or federal pressure." Chief Justice Carter stepped forward, his presence commanding absolute attention. "Judge Blackwood, you have systematically violated my son's constitutional rights as part of a deliberate conspiracy to undermine federal judicial authority. This proceeding ends now." The confrontation between the two judges represented more than personal conflict. It embodied the constitutional tension between federal oversight and state autonomy that had shaped American law since the founding. But in this moment, with overwhelming evidence of corruption and bias, federal authority was clearly supreme. Agent Hayes produced federal arrest warrants for Judge Blackwood and Sheriff Watkins. "Your Honor, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, a federal crime punishable by up to life imprisonment." The irony was perfect. The judge who had planned to sentence an innocent teenager to death now faced potential life imprisonment himself. As federal agents placed Judge Blackwood in handcuffs, Chief Justice Carter moved to his son's side. The image of America's highest-ranking judge embracing his wrongfully accused son would become iconic, representing both personal vindication and systemic triumph over corruption. "The charges against Elijah Carter are hereby dismissed," announced the federal magistrate who had been standing by to assume jurisdiction. "This case is transferred to federal court for investigation of civil rights violations." The courtroom erupted in applause as justice finally prevailed. Elijah Carter, who had entered that morning facing potential execution, walked out a free man, his ordeal finally over. The corrupt system that had targeted him lay in ruins, its key figures facing federal prosecution for their crimes against constitutional law. 6 months after the dramatic confrontation in Judge Blackwood's courtroom, the ripple effects of Elijah Carter's case had transformed not just Millbrook County, but criminal justice practices across the American South. The federal investigation that began with one teenager's wrongful arrest had evolved into the most comprehensive civil rights enforcement action in decades, dismantling corruption networks that had operated with impunity for generations. Judge Vernon Blackwood sat in federal prison, awaiting trial on conspiracy charges that could result in life imprisonment. His fall from local judicial authority to federal defendant had been swift and absolute, serving as a stark reminder that constitutional protection superseded any claims of state sovereignty. Sheriff Dale Watkins faced similar charges, while Deputy Roy Clemens had accepted a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against his former colleagues. The immediate consequences extended far beyond individual prosecutions. A federal consent decree now governed Millbrook County's entire criminal justice system, requiring court proceedings to be recorded, implementing bias training for all law enforcement personnel, and establishing civilian oversight boards with real authority to investigate complaints. Most significantly, all felony cases in the county were transferred to federal jurisdiction for a minimum of 5 years. Dr. Rachel Carter had taken a leave of absence from her law firm to lead the Civil Rights Division's Southern Justice Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to identify and eliminate discriminatory practices in rural court systems. Her work built directly on evidence uncovered during Elijah's case, expanding the investigation to encompass 12 counties across Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, where similar patterns of bias had been documented. What we discovered in Millbrook wasn't an aberration, Dr. Carter explained during a congressional hearing on judicial reform. It was a systematic approach to maintaining racial hierarchies through legal mechanisms. The same playbook was being used across dozens of jurisdictions, suggesting coordination that went far beyond local corruption. Her testimony led to the passage of the Constitutional Justice Act, federal legislation requiring enhanced oversight of state court systems and mandatory data collection on sentencing disparities. The law established federal monitoring of any jurisdiction where statistical evidence suggested discriminatory practices, with automatic intervention protocols that prevented cases like Elijah's from reaching crisis points. Meanwhile, Elijah himself had become an unlikely symbol of resistance against systemic injustice. His experience had transformed him from a privileged teenager, largely insulated from racism's worst effects, into a passionate advocate for criminal justice reform. Despite having every reason to retreat from public life, he chose instead to use his platform to amplify voices of those who lacked his family's advantages. At Georgetown University, where he had enrolled after deferring his Stanford admission, Elijah founded the Constitutional Defense Project, an organization that provided legal support to young people facing discriminatory prosecution. The group had already intervened in 43 cases across 15 states, preventing wrongful convictions and exposing corrupt practices in jurisdictions that assumed their actions would never face scrutiny. My case only received attention because of who my father is, Elijah told audiences during speaking engagements at law schools across the country. But for every story that makes headlines, there are hundreds of others that disappear into a system designed to silence them. Our job is to make sure those voices are heard. The Constitutional Defense Project had partnered with technology companies to develop an app that allowed citizens to report discriminatory policing and judicial practices in real time. The data collected through the app had already led to federal investigations in 6 additional jurisdictions, demonstrating how technology could democratize civil rights enforcement. Chief Justice Benjamin Carter had found his own role forever changed by his son's experience. While he maintained his judicial duties with characteristic professionalism, colleagues noted a new urgency in his approach to civil rights cases. His majority opinion in Thompson v. Alabama, which struck down death penalty procedures in states with documented racial bias, cited extensively from evidence uncovered during the Millbrook County investigation. The Constitution's promise of equal protection cannot be conditional on geography or local political preferences, Chief Justice Carter wrote in that landmark decision. When state systems systematically deny constitutional rights, federal intervention becomes not just appropriate, but mandatory. The decision faced criticism from conservative legal scholars who argued it represented federal overreach, but public opinion strongly supported the court's position. Polling data showed that 73% of Americans approved of increased federal oversight of state criminal justice systems, reflecting a fundamental shift in attitudes about states' rights versus constitutional protections. Patricia Monroe, the courthouse clerk whose secret recordings had provided crucial evidence, received federal whistleblower protections and a position with the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. Her courage in documenting corruption had inspired similar actions by court personnel in other jurisdictions, creating a network of internal monitors who helped federal authorities identify problematic patterns before they resulted in wrongful convictions. Emma Sinclair, the local student who had witnessed Elijah's arrest, successfully sued Millbrook County for witness intimidation and violation of her First Amendment rights. Her case established important precedents about citizens' rights to report police misconduct without facing retaliation. She used her settlement to establish a scholarship fund for students from underrepresented communities pursuing legal careers. The economic consequences for Millbrook County were severe, but ultimately regenerative. Initial estimates suggested the federal investigation and consent decree would cost the county nearly $2 million in the first year alone. However, the elimination of corruption and improved police-community relations began attracting businesses and residents who had previously avoided the area due to its reputation for injustice. Most remarkably, voter registration among minority communities in Millbrook County increased by 340% in the year following Elijah's case. The dramatic confrontation between federal and local authority had awakened civic engagement that transformed local politics. In the next election cycle, voters replaced the prosecutor who had sought to railroad Elijah, electing instead a reform-minded candidate committed to equal justice. The national conversation about racial bias in criminal justice had been fundamentally altered by the concrete evidence of systematic discrimination revealed through Elijah's case. No longer could defenders of discriminatory practices claim that disparities were coincidental or based on legitimate factors. The audio recordings from Millbrook County Courthouse provided undeniable proof of intentional bias that academic studies had long suggested but never definitively demonstrated. Law schools across the country began incorporating the Millbrook case into their curricula as a perfect example of how civil rights enforcement could work when properly applied. Students studied not just the legal precedents established, but the investigative techniques and coalition-building strategies that had made the victory possible. 6 months after his arrest, Elijah Carter stood in the same courthouse where he had nearly faced execution, this time addressing a crowd gathered to commemorate the establishment of the Millbrook County Civil Rights Memorial. The bronze plaque honored not just his experience, but the countless victims of discriminatory justice who had lacked the resources to fight back. This memorial represents more than one family's struggle, Elijah told the assembled crowd. It represents our collective commitment to ensuring that justice truly is blind to race, class, and political connections. The work isn't finished here, and it won't be finished until every courtroom in America lives up to constitutional ideals. As he spoke, federal monitors continued their work throughout the courthouse, documenting compliance with new procedures and ensuring that the reforms implemented after his case were being maintained. The transformation of Millbrook County from a symbol of judicial corruption to a model of civil rights enforcement represented the kind of systematic change that his father had spent his career trying to achieve. 2 years after that dramatic courtroom confrontation, Elijah Carter stood before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee as the youngest person ever nominated to serve on the Federal Civil Rights Commission. At 19, he had transformed from victim to advocate to federal appointee, his journey embodying the possibility of systematic change through individual courage and institutional accountability. Senators, Elijah began his confirmation testimony. My experience in Millbrook County taught me that constitutional rights are only as strong as our collective commitment to defending them. The question isn't whether discriminatory systems exist. It's whether we have the will to dismantle them when we find them. The hearing room was packed with civil rights leaders, legal scholars, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by the reforms sparked by Elijah's case. Among them sat Roosevelt Washington, the older man who had shared Elijah's jail cell that terrifying night 2 years earlier. Roosevelt now served as director of the Millbrook County Community Justice Center, a position created through the federal consent decree to ensure formerly incarcerated individuals had voice in reform efforts. Chief Justice Benjamin Arthur watched from the gallery as his son fielded questions about judicial bias, police accountability, and the proper balance between federal oversight and state sovereignty. The pride in his eyes was evident, but so was the weight of understanding how close they had come to losing everything. The system he had spent his career perfecting had nearly destroyed his own child, a reminder that justice remained fragile and required constant vigilance. The statistics presented during Elijah's confirmation hearing told a remarkable story of transformation. In the 24 months since the Millbrook intervention, similar federal investigations had been launched in 47 jurisdictions across 15 states. These investigations had resulted in the dismissal of over 300 wrongful convictions, the implementation of bias training for more than 12,000 law enforcement personnel, and the establishment of civilian oversight boards in communities that had never before questioned police authority. Dr. Rachel Carter, now serving as Associate Attorney General for Civil Rights, presented data showing a 38% reduction in racial sentencing disparities in jurisdictions subject to federal oversight. More importantly, public trust in the justice system had increased significantly in reformed communities, with citizen complaints about police misconduct dropping by more than half in areas where new accountability measures had been implemented. The Constitutional Defense Project, which Elijah had founded during his freshman year at Georgetown, had evolved into a nationwide network of student advocates providing legal support to young people facing discriminatory prosecution. The organization now operated chapters at 63 law schools, creating a pipeline of attorneys trained specifically in civil rights enforcement and community organizing. What we learned from the Millbrook case, testified Professor Sarah Chen, who had left federal practice to direct Georgetown Law School's new Civil Rights Clinic, is that systematic change requires both legal victory and community engagement. You can't simply impose reform from above. You have to build capacity for ongoing accountability at the local level. The technological innovations sparked by Elijah's case had revolutionized civil rights monitoring. The discrimination reporting app, developed by the Constitutional Defense Project, now processed over 15,000 reports monthly, using artificial intelligence to identify patterns that might indicate systematic bias. Federal authorities credited the app with helping them launch investigations that had prevented dozens of potential wrongful convictions. Emma Sinclair, now a sophomore at Yale Law School and recipient of the scholarship she had established, testified about the importance of witness protection in civil rights cases. Her experience of being intimidated after witnessing Elijah's arrest had led to new federal guidelines protecting citizens who reported police misconduct, ensuring they couldn't be silenced through economic or legal pressure. The courage to speak truth about injustice shouldn't require extraordinary circumstances, Emma told the senators. Every citizen should feel safe reporting violations of constitutional rights without fear of retaliation. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact had been in legal education itself. Law schools across the country had restructured their curricula to emphasize practical civil rights enforcement alongside traditional legal theory. Students now spent mandatory semesters working with community organizations, learning how systematic discrimination operated in practice rather than just studying it in textbooks. The Millbrook case had also influenced international human rights discourse. European legal scholars regularly cited the investigation as an example of how federal systems could address local violations of individual rights without sacrificing democratic governance. The case study was being used by transitional justice advocates in post-conflict societies as a model for rebuilding trust between communities and legal institutions. Judge Vernon Blackwood's eventual conviction and sentencing to 23 years in federal prison had sent shockwaves through judicial communities nationwide. For the first time in modern history, a sitting judge had received significant prison time for civil rights violations, establishing precedent that judicial immunity had limits when constitutional violations were deliberate and systematic. The ripple effects extended to police training academies, which now included comprehensive modules on unconscious bias and constitutional policing. The curriculum, developed collaboratively between federal civil rights attorneys and community advocates, emphasized de-escalation techniques and cultural competency training that had previously been absent from law enforcement education. Chief Justice Carter's subsequent judicial opinions had consistently reinforced the principles established through his son's case. His majority decision in Williams v. Georgia expanded federal oversight authority over state criminal justice systems, while his concurrence in Jackson v. Mississippi established new standards for identifying systematic bias in capital punishment cases. Legal scholars noted that his personal experience with discriminatory prosecution had added moral authority to his constitutional interpretation. During his confirmation hearing, Elijah was asked about the personal cost of becoming a public figure at such a young age. His response reflected the maturity forced upon him by his experience in Millbrook County. "Senator, I didn't choose to become a symbol of civil rights enforcement. That choice was made for me by people who thought they could use my father's position against our family. But I have chosen how to respond to that experience, and I choose to ensure it leads to lasting change." The hearing room erupted in applause as Elijah concluded his testimony with a commitment that captured the essence of his transformation from victim to advocate. "If confirmed, I pledge to use this position to ensure that no young person faces what I faced in Millbrook County. Constitutional rights aren't theoretical concepts. They're practical protections that must be enforced equally regardless of race, class, or family connections." As the hearing concluded, spectators filed out with a sense of witnessing history in the making. The young man, who had nearly been executed by a corrupt system, was now positioned to help reform that system from within federal institutions. His journey from defendant to nominee embodied the American ideal of justice emerging from injustice, of systematic change arising from individual courage. Outside the Capitol building, Elijah was surrounded by reporters asking about his future plans and the ongoing impact of his experience. His response was characteristically focused on others rather than himself. "This was never about my individual case. It was about exposing how discriminatory systems operate and building mechanisms to prevent future victims. That work continues, and it's bigger than any one person or position." As he walked away from the cameras, Elijah carried with him the knowledge that his teenage nightmare had ultimately become a catalyst for the kind of systematic change his father had spent decades pursuing through judicial decisions. The corrupt system that had tried to destroy him had instead been destroyed by the very constitutional principles it had sought to pervert. The legacy of Millbrook County would live on in reformed institutions, protected citizens, and a new generation of civil rights advocates who understood that justice required constant vigilance and collective action. In transforming personal trauma into public purpose, Elijah Carter had demonstrated that even the darkest experiences could illuminate the path toward a more perfect union. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.